Good evening. My name is Michael Dworkin. I have been involved with Physicians for Global Survival from its very beginning in 1982. But tonight is one of the biggest pleasures I can have in being a peace activist. I can speak to Naomi Klein, who, in fact, invited me to do so. So thank you, Naomi. Before I introduce Naomi, I just want to say what kind of a pleasure it is for me because I've known Naomi since she was an infant. Michael Klein, who hired me as a staff faculty member at the Jewish General Hospital in 1979, introduced me to the Klein family. Michael and Bonnie Klein obviously had great genes, and we have it in the affirmation of Naomi, who I've seen grow up and develop, and with great pride. Her career has kind of matched many of our interests in social justice, environment, and all the important things that we have to heal in this planet. The official bio
which you don't have to read.
is 26 pages long. The shortened version,
Please. Shorter.
short. I'll keep it short. No. Naomi is an award-winning journalist, syndicated columnist, and author of the international bestsellers This Changes Everything, The Shock Doctrine, and No Logo. Her column for The Nation magazine is syndicated internationally by the New York Times Syndicate, and she's a member of the board of directors of 350.org, a global grassroots movement to solve the climate crisis. She's a Puffin Foundation Writing Fellow at the Nation Institute. Her most recent book, the critic claimed This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, was the 2014 winner of the Hillary Weston Writers Trust Prize for Nonfiction and was a New York Times 100 Notable Book winner in 2014. It is now in paperback. It's being translated into over 25 languages. The documentary inspired by the book and narrated by Naomi premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival in September 2015 and is now available worldwide by the same name. This Changes Everything. It doesn't mention the fact that it was Avi Lewis who made the film, and Naomi just did the voiceover. This is going to be a very casual conversation. I'll pretend there's no audience. But if you do laugh, it'll be okay, especially at my jokes. Naomi, nice to see you. In your book, This Changes Everything, it's been enormously popular and has reached a wide audience. And now I learned that it's been translated in so many languages. Tell us what has transpired that during this amazing development that follows this book, and most importantly, what have you found that has been most gratifying for you in this process?
Thank you, Michael. Well, first, I just want to say how thrilled I am to be here with all of you, and to be doing this with you, Michael. If you were hired by my father in 1979, I was not an infant. I was 10. No, I was 9.
I thought you were big for a baby.
But I definitely remember lots of meetings at our house and improv and so on. And I grew up around groups like Physicians for Social Responsibility and being exposed to, from a very young age, the political nature of healthcare, because in fact that's why we live in Canada. So I want to recognize my father, Dr. Michael Klein, as he's the reason I'm here. And yeah, I grew up. We came to Canada because my father didn't want to go to Vietnam. And so I was born in Montreal in 1970. But then we moved back when I was 6 months old. We moved back to the U.S. and my dad, after having worked in the Canadian healthcare system, went back and worked in the American healthcare system. and then we decided as a family, I don't think I had much to say at age 5, to move back to Canada. And at that point, it was not about the war. It was about healthcare, really, more than anything. And it was explained to me at a very young age that we were going to live in Canada because in Canada you didn't have to be rich to get sick. And growing up around a medical researcher, I think had a really big impact on me. In terms of understanding or having some sense that research matters, because research was everywhere in my home. It was the main narrative in our household, and this crazy idea that facts can actually change things, that new facts can change things and can overturn accepted wisdom. So that particular pathology has been passed on through the generations. We continue to cling to this idea that facts change things. In terms of this kind of wild ride since This Changes Everything came out in September of 2014, I don't know about gratifying, but definitely one of the more weird and oddly wonderful moments was being invited to the Vatican and being at this press conference in front of the Vatican press corps and having the spokesperson for the Pope introduce me as a secular Jewish feminist.
Which is pretty accurate.
And at the time, I didn't realize just how radical that was until this woman a journalist came up to me afterwards, or she called me afterwards, and she said, "I've been covering the Vatican for 20 years, and I never thought I would hear them say the word feminist from that stage." So that was a good moment. And the publishing of the Pope's encyclical on climate change was just a really huge moment for the climate movement, because it is so intersectional. And I think it's had a tremendous impact. Ahead of that, there was a lot of negotiation ahead of my visit. Some quite direct, like, "You're not going to mention fetuses, are you?" and things like that. But they specifically asked me to talk about capitalism, to talk about the systemic nature of the crisis. And, that's so rare. Coming from a powerful institution, to be asked to be as radical as possible, except for on the women thing, that's still not okay. But what I took back from that experience at the Vatican was, obviously there are still huge differences, but sort of witnessing the speed of change that this Pope is trying to impose on, the oldest secret society in the world, and watching him rock that institution in that way, on every front, not just climate. I just sort of felt like, wow, like, we all have to change. What excuse do we have at, our green NGOs or our universities or wherever else it is that we're telling ourselves stories about how hard it is to change? If he can change the Vatican as quickly as he's changing it, like, we need to change faster in the face of these really urgent crises.
It's very interesting. You mentioned capitalism, and reminds me of the haves and the have-nots, which is a question of inequality. And inequality has been a major theme in this conference. Inequality of gender, children's rights inequalities, and the rich and the poor. And how does this relate to you in terms of climate change, the issue of inequality?
Well, I should say, I came to climate late as a writer and as an activist. I sort of was aware of it, cared about it. It's not like I was a denier per se, but I was certainly one of these people who said, I'm focused on more important issues, more urgent, like daily issues of economic justice, human rights, war. I mean, that was my work, right? And certainly the focus of my previous book, The Shock Doctrine, where I was reporting from Baghdad and all of these disaster zones, and it's sort of like climate change just felt very remote, kind of in the background. And I gave myself permission to just go like, this is one problem, I'm not gonna, this is, the environmentalists have this covered, I'm just gonna kind of bow out. And my wake-up call on that was Hurricane Katrina. I was in New Orleans when the city was underwater, and I was reporting for the shock doctrine for that book because it was already clear within 2 weeks that the Republicans were going to use this as a opportunity to privatize the city as much as they could, and they have, right? New Orleans has the most privatized school system in the United States. 96% of the public schools were reopened as charter schools, as privatized charter schools. Public housing was bulldozed, replaced with condos. The largest public hospital serving low-income people in New Orleans, Charity Hospital, has still not reopened. So, being in New Orleans in that moment, I guess it made me realize that that climate change has everything to do with inequality. It was like what I call, in the shock doctrine, I called it disaster apartheid, because it was, first of all, so racialized, right? I mean, if you had money, and that overwhelmingly meant if you were white in New Orleans, you were hit by the disaster, but you had resources, right? Like you could get into your car, drive out of the city, check into a hotel, call your insurance broker. But if you needed there to be a functioning public sphere, if you needed there to be a functioning commons, you were abandoned. And in New Orleans, that overwhelmingly meant black people who were abandoned on their rooftops, who were abandoned in the Superdome. And then, after they were abandoned by every level of government that couldn't seem to find New Orleans for 5 days, and so on, they were vilified and indeed monsterized, in the corporate press. Fox was talking about the animals in the Superdome and all of these, it turned out to be completely unfounded rumors about raping babies in the Superdome, things like that. I guess what made me realize that climate change is an accelerant. So if you have a problem of inequality, it will make your society more unequal. And if you have a problem with systemic racism, it will become more racist. I mean, there was, vigilantes were on the streets when I was there, just hunting. I mean, it was crazy, right? What it means is that people who are focused on these issues, core inequality issues, can't outsource climate change, can't say this is too remote. Like, we have to engage with this issue. But at the same time, I really believe that if we take climate change seriously, if we take the science seriously, and the urgency of this science-based deadline we are on, which says we need to lower our emissions by around 10% a year in countries like Canada, that it could be a catalyst for an investment in the public sphere that is our very best hope of reducing inequalities, systemic inequalities. And I think if we design policies with justice in mind, so this doesn't happen on its own, it has to be designed, we can radically reduce inequality and indeed begin to heal some of the wounds that date back to our country's founding.
You're alluding to First Nations inequalities.
Yeah, in Canada, so what would that look like? As we switch from fossil fuels to renewable energy, we would say that the communities that have had the worst deal under the current extractive economy, and that's overwhelmingly First Nations communities, communities of color that have the dirty refineries in their backyards, that are dealing with the direct bodily impacts of our addiction to fossil fuels through increased asthma rates and cancer clusters and all the stuff you guys are completely familiar with, that there would be a kind of energy reparations baked into the transformation. So we say, as we transition, as we invest the money, those communities need to be first in line to receive the public funds to own and control their own renewable energy projects, to get the skills, to keep the jobs, so that we don't repeat the same mistakes. Because you can do renewable energy in a really unjust way. You can, you can. And there have been examples of this here in Ontario, where First Nations communities have had solar projects or wind projects on their territory, have gotten no jobs, no skills training. They're basically just being used to get some kind of preferential treatment from the government. But I have friends in the Alberta tar sands, in the Lubicon Creek community of Little Buffalo, Beaver Lake Cree Nation, Athabasca Chippewa First Nation, where they are starting their own renewable energy projects that they own and control. They're getting the jobs and the skills and the revenue from generating that. But they're funding it by going to foundations, by doing Kickstarter campaigns. We're saying this should be policy, at every level.
Your example of the hurricane at Katrina reflects just one way that Mother Nature is fighting back climate change. And the tragedy that's going on right now in Fort McMurray with the fires out of control and the city nearly burnt down also suggests that Mother Nature is fighting back. I wonder if you can comment about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were in, this is this moment where I think the reality of just that I think sometimes in wealthier countries we imagine ourselves to be safe, right? We imagine that climate change is something that impacts more vulnerable people, poor people, people living in the global south more than us. There's even some idea that it would be good for Canada, right? We'd have a longer growing season. We'd open up a shipping passage, in the Arctic, drill for oil. This is real stuff. I think the Harper government fully understood climate change, and they actually thought that it could be a net benefit. So we clearly aren't immune, and this is this wake-up call is happening in many places in the global north. The question is how we react to it, right? I was recently in the UK, and they've had these historic floods this past winter, and also 2 winters ago. They have a right-wing government that has cut back flood defense very strongly. So you see this sort of toxic combination that we saw in New Orleans of austerity politics, the steady erosion of the public sphere, colliding with heavy weather, right? And it's not a good combination. But what's happening in the UK is that the right is riling up anti-foreigner sentiment, anti-foreign aid sentiment. So they're saying, well, we should cut all of our foreign aid and just help people at home. Why should we help people in Bangladesh when people are hurting in Kent, right? And it's like, well, because you invented the steam engine and you've been burning coal on an industrial scale longer than anyone else, and we actually owe a debt to people in Bangladesh. And so, there has to be, this is why, I argue that unless there's a shift in values, unless we are talking about solidarity as a basic human value, then the way we respond to climate change is not just going to make things hotter and wetter, it's going to make things meaner and uglier, right? So back to Fort Mac. Fort Mac, when we were filming there for our film 2 years ago, it was actually underwater. It had suffered some terrible floods. Calgary was flooded terribly just this past summer, and it should go without saying, but this is a horrific tragedy. We've all heard these reports where it's impossible not to be incredibly moved, right? I just heard this interview, I think many people heard it on The Current, of this school principal who took this bus full of children racing around. Just like I start crying just thinking about it, right? But I think the Canadian media is doing us a disservice by not talking about climate change now. I understand that maybe we didn't want to be talking about it while people were fleeing the city. Yeah, okay, I get that. But one of the problems we have is climate change is a very difficult story for the media to tell, right? When there isn't a disaster, the reason it's not in the paper is because everything else is more urgent, right? So that's the excuse during non-disasters. But then when there is a disaster, we're told, well, that's opportunistic. We're going to do another story about a stranded kitten, right? And I must say, I've heard enough about Fort McMurray's pets. And I say that because I think the Canadian media has done an absolutely abysmal job of humanizing the impact of our emissions on people in the global south, people whose countries are disappearing beneath the waves, in part because of our collective actions, not this is not just about the workers in Fort McMurray, it's all of us, it's our collective emissions, right? But do we read stories about the losses, faced by people living in the Marshall Islands or Tuvalu or Bangladesh? I think that, I did read another story today about a cat, and there was a story last week about a pig named Marshall, a beer-swilling pig named Marshall in Fort McMurray who was rescued, and it went viral and so on. And I did on the CBC, and I did a search on how often the CBC had mentioned the Marshall Islands, which is because his name was Marshall, so it was sort of a gimme. And I couldn't find a single story, about the climate impacts on the Marshall Islands. So this should be a wake-up call, but I think our media is doing us a disservice with this idea that it's somehow impolite to talk about climate change during a disaster. The cover of Bloomberg, the week Hurricane Sandy hit, was Bloomberg's Business Week. The cover was "It's global warming, stupid," with a picture of a massive wave, right? So and it's not just global warming, it's El Nino, but what we know is that the reason why we're breaking temperature records all around the world is that climate change is supercharging this El Nino, right? So we have to talk about it. And if we can't talk about it during non-disasters because it's boring, and we can't talk about it during disasters because it's opportunistic, we never talk about it, right?
The central theme of your book is human rights of the indigenous people who have had their lands contaminated by relentless exploitation of their natural resources. I feel the recurring news of the suicide epidemics among indigenous youth is a symptom of this problem by robbing young people of a meaningful future. I think there are connections there.
I think there are connections there, and they're complex, as many of you know. But one of the things that's really striking that I've learned from speaking to Indigenous friends is that reconnecting with nature and getting on the land, doing ceremony, is medicine, is treatment, is the best treatment for despair, right, for Indigenous young people. So if that's the treatment, then that tells us something about what the ailment is in terms of the separation from the land, right? And I always think about, I was in Washington, D.C. The first and only time I've ever been arrested was an act of civil disobedience against the Keystone XL pipeline. And there was a training for people to get arrested the night before in a church, and I gave a talk about the tar sands that night. And afterwards, Tantu Cardinal, the wonderful actress, people know Tantu, she's kind of an amazing actor. She came up to me and said, I'm from Fort McMurray. That's where I was born, and I was not allowed to drum. And she told me this story about how she never ever heard drums, and how ceremony was banned, and how the healers had to practice in secret. And what she was saying was they couldn't have done the damage to the land that they did without severing the connection to the land and culture. And that's what residential schools were about, right? So I think that's why the answer is complex, because it's multi-layered, because we're also dealing with intergenerational trauma from that original, very deliberate severing of Indigenous people from the land and the culture that is embedded in the land in order to facilitate resource extraction. So I think it's intimately connected.
And we're still living with that shame. I'm going to switch a little topic here in terms of...
We aren't just living with it, we're recommitting the crime.
Exactly.
Over and over and over again.
In your book, I was attracted to the concept of building resilient communities as a means of developing local economies and decentralizing energy production. Can you describe some of the steps that you envision in this process?
Yeah, so I mean, there's this huge literature around resilience and climate adaptation. And much of the focus is on the sort of infrastructure, the resilient infrastructure, and storm barriers and porous concrete and things like that. And that's all important. And decentralized energy grids are less susceptible to these shocks that sort of knock out an entire system. But honestly, I think that the most important form of resilience is actually community, is knowing, just having spent a fair amount of time in disaster zones like Katrina or Sandy in New York after Sandy, it's so clear that the places that survive best are where people know their neighbors, are able to check in on their neighbors in moments like that, where people are keeping track of each other, and the isolation of so much of modern life, right, that encourages us to see ourselves, as atomized individuals and to be frightened of one another becomes really, really dangerous during disasters. During Sandy, there were, met people in housing projects who just locked themselves in because they were afraid, right? And nobody checked on them, and so yeah, I think our most important tool of resilience is that work of community building on every front.
One of the outcomes of the book has been an interest by other leaders in the environmental field in Canada who've gotten together and developed with you the LEAP Manifesto. And immediately the newspapers branded this as a lefty activity. And then the NDP said they want to look into it. PGS at the board meeting thought we'd explore the LEAP Manifesto. How many in the audience have never heard of the LEAP Manifesto? Never heard. So it's obviously heard of, but still most of the conventional press is not interested in picking up on it. No surprise.
We got a lot of press, but it was mostly like telling us it was a plot to destroy the country. Even Brian Mulroney even came out of retirement to say that it was a threat to the country and must be defeated at all costs. We were pretty excited. We had Conrad Black wrote 5 columns attacking it. So we have good enemies, at any rate.
But the issue of nonpartisanship.
Yeah. So the LEAP. So the LEAP came out of a meeting that our team convened exactly a year ago, actually, here in Toronto, and the wonky name for that meeting was price shock to energy shift, which is not a good name for a meeting at all. But basically, what it came out of was an understanding that shocks to societies generally lead to pretty significant change. And in the past, in the neoliberal period, in the past 40 years, generally crises, particularly economic crises, have become moments to impose austerity and further attacks on the public sphere. So we realized at this point that the dramatic drop in the price of oil that has only gotten more dramatic since that meeting was going to be some kind of a catalyst. And if we just sort of left the shock to its own devices, it would probably play out eventually as austerity, as the excuse to cut social services, and because we've seen it so many times before. So we decided to try to get ahead of it and strategize there were 65 movement leaders, very cross-sectoral, indigenous, climate, labor, faith, women, migrant rights. It was a really, really great meeting. And strategize about, well, if we took this price shock as a sort of a catalyst that said there's something wrong with the way we've been running our economy, right? That this roller coaster, this commodity roller coaster clearly isn't working. Could it be the catalyst to seriously respond to climate change, to shift our energy system? Because under the Harper years, we were told that we had to choose between a healthy economy and a strong environment, and a good environment, a healthy environment. But now we were getting neither, right? Because we'd bet everything on oil and the price of oil collapsed. So that could be a catalyst. So out of that meeting and out of the discussions in that meeting, we collectively wrote this thing called the LEAP Manifesto. And what's different about the LEAP, and it's not long, so I would encourage everyone to read it. It's 1,400 words. It's the length of a long op-ed, and you can read it at leapmanifesto.org. Was we really wanted, we wanted to dream about the society we actually want, not just sort of reject, but propose. But we also wanted to sort of weave. We didn't want it to just be another sort of list of left-wing demands. We wanted, it's an alternative narrative about how all of these issues are interconnected. So it's a very intersectional document. It's about the connection between climate and indigenous rights and the impact of climate on migration and what our duties are to people who've been displaced by our quest for fossil fuels and the wars that have ensued, and also the impacts of our successful burning of those fossil fuels, and also the pushing of trade deals that have been have had very negative impacts all over the world. So it is this sort of other story, and it is a nonpartisan document. We launched it in the middle of the election, frankly, because we thought there would be a coalition government. I'll just be honest with you. Okay, so what we felt was going to happen, or we thought there was a really likely scenario, was that Harper would be out, and we would end up with some cobbled together coalition of the NDP and the Liberals and the Greens. And we saw that neither the Liberals nor the NDP was putting climate change front and center. Right. Neither of them had a science-based climate plan, because both parties had picked a pipeline to cheer for. Right. And so we decided that if there was a coalition, that coalition would be susceptible to pressure from the outside. So we wrote the document. It's now been endorsed by 200 organizations and many Canadian artists, including Bruce Cockburn. And you asked me a highlight early on. I think even more than the Pope was when Leonard Cohen signed the LEAP Manifesto. That was a big, that was a big highlight for our team. And so, there has been this big debate ever since the NDP passed this resolution to supporting the principles and deciding to debate the specifics of the manifesto at the riding level. And all hell broke loose. And it broke loose because there is a line in the manifesto that says that we cannot build any new fossil fuel infrastructure, that we have to invest in the infrastructure of the future. And so that means no new pipelines. And so the reason why it became so polarizing is, frankly, it's less about the LEAP and more about the fact that the NDP government in Alberta really is bound and determined to get a pipeline or two. And so their fight is less with us than it is with, the 70% of Quebecers that don't want Energy East, or the 80% of British Columbians that don't want, more tanker traffic on their coast. So somehow it became a symbol for all of that, and I think it was really unfortunate the way it played out, but it is not a partisan document. I mean, we want everyone to pick it up, most of all the party that is in power. The Greens have already endorsed it, and so has Quebec Solidaire, so it isn't just the NDP.
But one of the goals of the LEAP Manifesto is to reach 100% electricity from renewable sources by the year 2050. Won't that be too late?
So what the LEAP actually says is we want to get to 100% renewables for electricity in 2 decades, and 100% for all energy, including transportation, by 2050. So it's more ambitious than most of those targets. And this is based on research that has been done at Stanford University by Mark Jacobson's team that says that we can do it with existing technologies, and we don't need fracking, and we don't need tar sands, we don't need Arctic drilling. We can do it with conventional fossil fuels in 2 decades for electricity, and the rest of it by 2050 or sooner. So is it too late? I mean, I think it's as ambitious as we could hope to be.
And there's always the urgency. Nuclear power doesn't play a big part in your book, and it's been a passion of our organization for many years, the concern that nuclear energy will bridge us into getting away from fossil fuels and into renewables, and we don't think nuclear energy is sustainable, safe, or by any means affordable. Any comments about that?
Yeah,
I got to get my 2 cents in on
yeah,
nuclear.
I agree with you. And it is in the book, but there should be more in the book about it.
Never mind the 17,000 nuclear weapons, but I don't want to spoil your dessert appetite.
What I love about Mark Jacobson's research at Stanford is he specifically says that we can get to 100% without nuclear. I think what's so interesting about the way the nuclear debate is playing out in climate circles is that they're using technologies that don't exist yet or are certainly not being deployed yet as the excuse to build the old stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So they dangle this prospect of next generation nuclear and all of this gee whiz stuff that's only going to use waste and so on. But what they're actually building is conventional, nuclear power plants. This was a really big issue during the Paris summit because France is, it's a nuclear country, and the French government opened up the summit to sponsorship from nuclear power companies that were marketing nuclear power as climate solution. They also invited in lots of big agribusiness companies to market GMO seeds as a climate solution and so on. So we have to be, and this is why we wrote the LEAP manifesto, because there, a couple years back, in New York, there was a huge climate march in September of 2014, and it was beautiful. There were, almost 500,000 people on the streets. But the only demand of the march was climate action. And the truth is, that's dangerous. It's amazing that there were so many people out there, but we can't just say we want action and not define what we mean by action. Because if we just create the momentum for action, what will happen is that action will be defined as nuclear power, GMO, private water, the rest of it, right? So that's why the movement has to write its own blueprints, and there are many attempts, the LEAP Manifesto is one of them, to really outline what a climate justice response looks like. And it doesn't include nuclear. And it doesn't include nuclear because, if you define the problem, as I do in the book, as the problem is the extractive worldview and the idea that there are always going to be sacrifice zones that eat the risk for you, right? Then
indigenous people specifically.
Yeah, then nuclear is the epitome of that, not the solution.
We have only a couple of questions left, but I want to interrupt this lovely dialogue by alerting the audience to a very important accomplishment that Naomi Klein has just received, the Sydney Peace Foundation Award as the iconoclastic author of and receives the 2016 Sydney Peace Prize. They chose Naomi for exposing the structural causes and responsibility for the climate crisis, for inspiring us to stand up locally, nationally, and internationally, and to demand a new agenda for sharing the planet that respects human rights and equality. A well-deserved prize.
Thank you. They just announced it today.
I'm hot off the press. Aren't you impressed? On a personal level, Naomi, what's it like to work with Abby on his movie, This Changes Everything, and maintain your individuality and your couple nurturing, etc.? Only a friend could ask that kind of question, right?
We've always collaborated. And Avi edits all my writing, and I, he always called me his shadow producer when he was working at CBC, and we have worked together before on a previous film called The Take, which we made together in Argentina about workers who turning their factories into cooperatives, factories that were being closed down in the midst of the economic crisis. This project the way we did it was, first of all, it was not Avi adapting the book as a film. We did it in parallel. So for 5 years, I was writing the book and he was making the film, and we were sharing ideas and information. But it was very clear that the book was mine and the film was his. But it certainly, that part was pretty straightforward. Where I guess it became more complicated was Avi blew his deadline, and the film came out significantly after the book. And because of that, at that point, the book was like very firmly established as me, right? And so now often the film gets talked about as my film, and it really isn't. It's Avi's film. So the working together part, I mean, look, it's always hard, but it was very clear that it was Avi's film, and it still is Avi's film, but often it gets talked about as my film. But he's a tough guy. He can handle it. It's like, think of all the women who did work and never got their husbands took credit for it.
Activism. I mean, we talk about Michael Klein. There's Bonnie Klein has recently awarded the Canadian Governor General's Award. No, at
Order of Canada. What? Order of Canada.
Yeah, Order of Canada. Order of Canada. So this is high-functioning family. Your vision requires a democratic revolution to rein in the greedy corporations and the self-interested political leaders. That's what comes out of your book. Is it happening, and will it be fast enough for the accelerated timeframe of climate change?
Is it happening? Well, it's interesting. Like the book came out in 2014. It's hard to believe that it's been almost 2 years, but it's really encouraging when I look at how much has happened since the book came out, right? What isn't in the book in terms of reasons why we might take hope, because you're absolutely right that I am making the argument that climate change changes everything, right? Because if we stay on this road we're on and everything changes about our physical world, but we've delayed and delayed and delayed, and now getting off that road requires such radical action that in order to do it, we have to pretty much change everything about our political and economic system. I mean, it lights up issues like the incredible power of fossil fuel companies and banks over our political system. It explodes the logic of austerity because we have to invest massively in the public sphere. We've got a huge problem with these free trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which actively stand in the way of governments that try to say no to fracking, like Quebec, which is being challenged under NAFTA for banning fracking by a Canadian company that incorporated in the US so they could use the investor clause in NAFTA that allows corporations to sue governments for their right to sue to frack under the St. Lawrence. There are many examples of that here in Ontario. We've been successfully challenged at the WTO for requiring that green technologies be produced, a certain percentage of them, locally in Ontario, created thousands of jobs. The WTO ruled it protectionist. So it lights up all of this. Suddenly you're talking about all these structural issues of the rules of our free trade agreement, campaign finance, austerity, the clawing back of the public sphere. I mean, one of the parts of the LEAP manifesto that I'm most excited about is our attempt to redefine what a climate job is, what a green job is. That it isn't only the people who are putting up solar panels and wind turbines, it's them too, and investing in public transit, but it's also the low carbon work of the caring professions. It's the work of teaching our kids and caring for the elderly, and it's the arts, and it's all of this work that isn't recognized as low carbon, as long as we don't go to too many conferences, right? But so it lights all of this up. But the good news is the appetite for that kind of systemic change is greater than at any point in my lifetime. I can say that with confidence. And so when I look at these 2 years, I mean, I launched the book in September 2014, and that week, I did a panel with a guy named Bernie Sanders in New York City. And he was thinking about running for president. And we're like, oh, Bernie, don't be silly. No, I mean, it's kind of like,
Such
all right,
a name dropper.
give it a whirl, But we didn't really think it would go anywhere, But here he is, just sort of telling bold truths and putting out bold ideas, and it is resonating so strongly with people. And what's resonating, look, he's not going to get the nomination. I think that's clear. But the Democratic Party is in crisis because this has become a referendum about the legacy of neoliberalism, the legacy of these attacks on the public sphere and this idea that only the market can fix things. And this whole generation, the Sanders generation, that is hearing these ideas for the first time, right? Like, whoa, free education, public health care, what a fantastic idea. And they're loving it, right? So all of this has happened in 2 years. I mean, it's just the Pope. There's been a huge change in the UK, where the Labour Party is now led by Jeremy Corbyn, which came out of a similar process of young people joining the party in droves and rejecting the sort of whole legacy of New Labour and Blairite politics and saying, no, we want more systemic change. So I would say there's a lot of evidence that people are ready for this. But we're on a deadline. We are on this very firm and unyielding deadline. And I would say the movement is moving. I mean,
it's leaping, in fact.
I mean, as we speak, the Kinder Morgan plant in Vancouver is surrounded by thousands of activists. There's break-free actions going on around the world this week, taking aim at the so-called carbon bombs, the carbon that cannot come out of the ground if we are going to have a chance of meeting the targets we set in Paris. So the movement, we're moving, but the problem is climate change is happening faster too. James Hansen published a study a couple months ago. It's just terrifying, with 18 co-authors, peer-reviewed, saying that the sea level rise that we thought was going to take thousands of years actually could happen this century, and would mean the end of every coastal city. Not will happen, but could happen. And he's saying 2 degrees, which is how our government's defined dangerous warming, is reckless, and we have to shoot for much lower, or 1.5 is our only hope. So it's a race against time. It's a race against time, and this is why I think it is important now that everyone in Fort McMurray is safe, and we can be extremely thankful to everyone who made that happen and made that possible. We have to have the conversation. We have to leap, right, in these moments, in these wake-up calls. We can't waste them, right? And we're in one, actually. We're in one.
I wanted the last question to be somewhat of a message of hope, and I think you've done that already, but maybe there's one final commentary on hope in the time of urgency and political activism. In this sort of race against time and just how much work there is and how little time we have, it's I wouldn't say the odds are in our favor, right? I think if you were just betting, you wouldn't bet on us. But if you were betting, there's something wrong with you. If I have a friend named John Powell. He teaches at UC Berkeley, and he calls himself a possibilist, not an optimist, right? Which is like, if we can see any pathway, Bernie talks about there's still a pathway to victory. If there's any pathway, and there is still a pathway, then it is, the stakes are so incredibly high then that it is a moral responsibility to do everything in our power to increase those chances, to increase the possibility, to improve the odds. And that's all we can do, right? Wendell Berry, the wonderful poet farmer from Kentucky, he says, we don't have the right to ask if we're going to win. We only have the right to ask, what does the earth require of us if we're going to continue to live on it? And then we just have to do it. Or he says it sort of like that. That's a beautiful way to end. I'd like to thank Naomi for sharing her thoughts with this group of wonderful people. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It was a pleasure.